Look at this highlighted map very closely. What this is showing is the percentage of people with access to electricity by country. Parts of the African continent look like they are on a completely different planet. There are countries on the continent where less than 10% of the population has access to electricity. So let me ask you this: is Africa rising? In another video, I presented evidence of Africa rising. I will leave a link to that video in the description. But there is always a flip side to every story. So in this video, I would like to talk about the not so rising parts of the African continent. Welcome to Africa Unchained, a new channel dedicated to educating the African youth, the future leaders of the continent. A channel designed to inspire and motivate the generation dubbed the Cheetah Generation by Ghanaian economist George Ayite. A channel whose overall and long-term objective is to sow the seeds of an African renaissance. I already showed you the map showing limited access to electricity. Now let's look at poverty on the continent. Clearly, the poverty rate has declined from almost 60% in 1994 to 35% in 2019. But here's the thing. Because the population in many countries is growing at such a rapid pace, although the share of people in poverty is lower, the number of people in poverty has risen. In 1994, when the extreme poverty rate was almost 60%, the population in sub-Saharan Africa was estimated at about 580 million. So 348 million people lived in poverty then. But in 2019, when the poverty rate was 35%, the population on the continent stood at over 1.2 billion, which means that more than 433 million people lived in extreme poverty in 2019. And since then, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the poverty rate has increased. So there are even more people living in poverty in 2022 compared to 2019. As a consequence, about 60% of the world poor live in Africa. But the continent accounts for only 17% of the world population. Poverty remains widespread because of lower growth in average income. While aggregate growth has been higher in many countries since the turn of the millennium, economic growth per person has been lower because the population growth is very high. For example, aggregate economic growth in Uganda was 6.4% in 2019, but population growth was 3.5%, so average income grew by only 2.7%. Contrast this to a country like Vietnam. The Vietnamese economy expanded by 7% in 2019, but its population grew by only 1%, resulting in a 6% expansion in income per person. Plus, the economic growth in most African countries has been superficial at best because the drivers of growth have unfortunately been commodities as opposed to investment in physical and human capital. The low investment in physical capital has translated into limited adequate physical infrastructure, especially electricity and transport infrastructure. It is impossible to build an industry without electricity and good transport infrastructure. And building an industrial base is the most powerful way of reducing poverty. In fact, countries that have managed to industrialize have been able to rapidly lift millions of people out of poverty. But industrialization is still very limited on the continent, which is one of the reasons why many people continue to live in poverty. Africa's manufacturing output is only 1% of global manufacturing output. In addition to the limited infrastructure, education remains a challenge. Yes, more children have access to education now than ever on the continent. But imagine that 98 million children in sub-Saharan Africa are out of school. That is 40% of the total number of children out of school worldwide. But here's the other catch. Even the children who are in school are not doing well because the quality of education they have access to is pretty abysmal. This results in a twin deficit in education, limited access and not enough learning. While the rest of the world is looking to teach primary school students advanced cognitive skills such as computer programming to better prepare them for the future, African countries are still struggling to provide universal access to basic education. Schools are overcrowded, again because the population is growing very fast and governments are not building schools and hiring teachers fast enough. Despite the increase in economic activities, intra-trade on the continent, that is trade between African countries, is very low at less than 20% of total trade in Africa. This is due to several factors such as the lack of transport connection and inefficient and corrupt customs at border crossings, which contribute to making good transport on the continent prohibitively expensive. For instance, according to some estimates by The Economist, it costs $2,000 to ship a container from China to Beira in Mozambique, but it costs an additional $5,000 to ship it 500 kilometers inland to Malawi. Furthermore, agricultural production is still lagging despite the continent having 60% of the world's arable land. And as a consequence of low agricultural production, food insecurity on the continent is high. We haven't even talked about corruption and bad governance. Public coffers are looted to finance individual projects. Youth unemployment is rampant. So, although there has been some progress, a lot of it has been superficial. We need deep and broad policy reforms to bring about meaningful progress to the African population. And as we talk about Africa rising, we must be careful to nuance the narrative. This is Africa Unchained. Like, share, and subscribe.